Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. I used to believe love was supposed to feel like effort, like holding your breath underwater and convincing yourself it was normal. For 3 years, that's how I lived with Daniel. I told myself that tightness in my chest meant commitment, not fear. I told myself that when he joked at my expense in front of his friends, it was just his sense of humor. I told myself that when he rolled his eyes every time I shared an idea or corrected me mid-sentence or laughed when I cried, it was because he was honest, and honesty was better than softness. That's what I told myself, because admitting the truth would have meant admitting I was shrinking. The night everything broke open didn't start dramatically. It started with a dinner I had spent hours preparing, even though I'd worked a full day and my feet ached. Daniel had invited his coworkers over without asking me first. "They won't care," he said when I hesitated. "Just order something or throw together whatever." But I cared. I always cared. I wanted the apartment to feel warm, welcoming. I wanted him to be proud of me, even though I didn't know why that mattered so much anymore. By the time they arrived, the food was laid out, candles lit, and I had changed my clothes twice because Daniel had laughed at the first outfit. "You look like you're trying too hard," he'd said. So I put on something simpler, quieter, more invisible. During dinner, they talked about work projects I didn't understand, inside jokes I wasn't part of. I smiled anyway, refilled glasses, asked questions when there was a pause. At one point, one of his coworkers asked how we met. I started to answer because it was a story I used to love. We met at a bookstore, both reaching for the same dog-eared novel, but Daniel cut in before I could finish a sentence. "She likes to romanticize it," he said, chuckling. "Truth is, she followed me around the store for 20 minutes. Everyone laughed. I felt my face burn, but I forced a smile because correcting him would have made things awkward. I told myself it didn't matter. Then came the moment I still replay at night sometimes. One of the women at the table complimented the food, said it was amazing. Before I could say thank you, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, "Yeah, she had all day to do it. She's not exactly ambitious." The laughter that followed was louder this time. Someone added, "Must be nice." Daniel shrugged, enjoying it. I laughed too because I didn't know what else to do. Inside, something cracked. After everyone left, the apartment felt too quiet. I started cleaning automatically, stacking plates, swiping counters, my hands shaking just enough that I noticed. Daniel sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I finally asked him why he'd said that about me. I tried to keep my voice calm, reasonable. He sighed like I was inconveniencing him. "You're too sensitive," he said. "It was a joke. If you can't handle that, that's on you." I told him it hurt, that I felt small when he talked about me like that. He looked at me then, really looked, and his expression hardened. "You're always playing the victim," he said. "Honestly, I don't know why you make such a big deal out of everything." Something in me snapped into focus, not anger, clarity. I realized I had been explaining myself for years to someone who benefited from not understanding. I told him I was tired, that I didn't feel respected, that I needed space. I didn't plan to leave that night. I just wanted him to hear me. Instead, he laughed, not a nervous laugh, a confident one. "Leave if you want," he said, waving his hand like he was dismissing a waiter. "You'll be back begging within a month. You always are." The words landed heavier than anything else he'd ever said, because they weren't just cruel, they were certain. He believed he owned my doubt. He believed my fear would always be stronger than my self-respect. I stood there, staring at him, feeling something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Pride, maybe, or desperation finally transforming into resolve. I went into the bedroom and pulled out a suitcase. My hands moved before my mind could catch up. I packed clothes, toiletries, the book I'd been reading. Daniel watched from the doorway, arms crossed, smirk in place. "You're being dramatic," he said. "You'll calm down." I didn't respond. I zipped the suitcase and lifted it, surprised by its weight, surprised by how heavy 3 years can feel when you try to carry them at once. At the door, my hand on the knob, I turned back to him. I don't know what I expected to see. Regret, maybe? Fear? An apology? Instead, he looked bored. "Don't forget your keys when you come crawling back." I walked out. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking. My heart pounded so loudly, I wondered if the neighbors could hear it. When the elevator doors closed, I leaned against the wall and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I drove to my sister's apartment across town, hands trembling on the steering wheel. When she opened the door and saw my suitcase, she didn't ask questions. She just hugged me tight, the way you do when you know words would break something open too soon. That night, lying on her couch, staring at the ceiling, I thought about Daniel's words. "You'll be back begging within a month." Part of me was terrified he was right. Another part, quieter but growing, whispered that even if I did go back, something had already changed. I had walked out. I had chosen myself, even if I didn't know what that meant yet. I fell asleep with that thought, unaware that the month ahead would test me in ways I couldn't imagine, and that his certainty would become the very thing that saved me. The first morning after I left him, I woke up disoriented, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like my sister's laundry detergent instead of Daniel's cologne. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then it came rushing back. The dinner, the laughter, his voice, sharp and amused, telling me I'd be back begging. My chest tightened, and I had to sit up, pressing my feet into the carpet just to remind myself where I was. My sister, Nadia, was already up, the sound of a kettle whistling softly in the kitchen. She didn't ask why I was there. She just poured me tea and slid a mug into my hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. Those first few days felt unreal, like I was walking around without skin. Everything touched me too deeply. Every notification on my phone made my stomach flip because part of me expected his name to appear, some message that would pull me back into orbit. But Daniel didn't text. Not that day, not the next. His silence was louder than his insults had ever been. It made me question myself. If he really thought I'd be back so quickly, why wasn't he even trying to stop me? By day 3, doubt started to creep in. I replayed every argument we'd ever had, searching for evidence that I was overreacting. I told myself maybe I should have waited, chosen a better moment, explained myself more clearly. Nadia noticed the way I stared at my phone and finally said gently, "You don't look like someone who's missing him. You look like someone who's detoxing." I laughed, but it stuck with me. Detoxing hurts, even when the thing you're giving up is poison. On the 4th day, Daniel finally messaged me. Just one line. "You done throwing your tantrum?" My hand shook as I read it. No apology, no concern, just the assumption that my pain was performative. I didn't reply. That felt like a small victory, but also like standing on the edge of a cliff. I didn't know who I was without responding to him. For years, my reflex had been to smooth things over, to explain, to make sure he was comfortable. Silence felt rebellious. As the days turned into a week, reality set in. I still had to go to work, I still had bills, I still had a life to manage. Only now it was without the constant background noise of Daniel's opinions. At first, the quiet was unsettling. Then it became soothing. I noticed things I hadn't before, how my shoulders didn't tense when I laughed, how I could finish a thought without being interrupted, how I slept through the night without waking up anxious. Daniel didn't like being ignored. His messages became more frequent, more pointed. "You're really dragging this out. Everyone thinks you're being ridiculous. You're embarrassing yourself." Each one was designed to pull me back into the familiar cycle of defending myself. I still didn't reply. Instead, I started writing everything down, every insult I remembered, every time I'd felt small. Seeing it on paper stripped it of its power. It wasn't isolated incidents, it was a pattern. Around the second week, something unexpected happened. I ran into an old friend from college, Mira, at a coffee shop near my office. We hadn't spoken in years, not since I'd slowly disappeared into Daniel's world. She hugged me and said, "You look lighter." I almost cried right there in line. We talked for an hour, catching up, and when I told her I'd left my boyfriend, she didn't ask why. She said, "Good. I always thought you deserved better." It startled me how easily she said it, like it had been obvious all along. That night, Daniel called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice was smooth, almost charming, like it used to be when he wanted something. "So," he said, "you ready to come home yet?" Home. The word felt foreign. I told him I wasn't coming back. There was a pause, then a laugh. "Don't be dramatic. You can't even afford to live on your own. You'll see." When the call ended, my hands were cold, but my mind was clear. I realized something crucial in that moment. He wasn't missing me. He was missing the version of me that made his life easier, the one who cooked, cleaned, listened, absorbed his moods without complaint. And that realization hurt, but it also freed me. By the third week, I started making plans, real ones. I looked at my finances honestly for the first time in years. I updated my resume. I even toured a tiny studio apartment that smelled faintly of paint and possibility. Standing there, sunlight streaming through a single window, I felt a flicker of excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. Fear was still there, but it wasn't in control anymore. Daniel noticed the shift. His messages changed tone, less mocking, more urgent. "We should talk. I've been thinking. You're making a mistake." The irony didn't escape me. He was the one who had told me to leave. He was the one who had been so sure I'd come back begging. Now his certainty was cracking. One evening, as I sat on Nadia's couch, signing the lease for that tiny studio, my phone buzzed again. Another message from him. "You really think you can do better?" I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. Just one sentence. "I already am." Hitting send felt like closing a door gently but firmly. I moved into my apartment at the end of the month he'd been so sure would break me. It was small and imperfect, but it was mine. As I unpacked, I thought about his words, how confidently he had said them. "You'll be back begging within a month." I wasn't begging, I was building, and I knew deep down that the hardest part was still ahead, because Daniel wasn't done trying to rewrite the story. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let him try. The first night alone in my new apartment, I sat on the floor eating takeout from the carton because I hadn't unpacked the plates yet. The silence felt different here. It wasn't the tense quiet that followed arguments with Daniel, the kind where you wait for the next jab. This silence was spacious, honest. It let my thoughts stretch out instead of curling inward. I should have felt lonely. Instead, I felt cautious, like someone stepping into sunlight after a long time underground. Of course, freedom doesn't arrive without echoes. Daniel's voice still lived in my head, commenting on my choices. When I hung a crooked picture frame, I imagined him smirking, telling me I'd done it wrong. When I burnt toast one morning, I heard him sighing dramatically, taking over. I realized how deeply his presence had embedded itself into my everyday life. Leaving him hadn't erased that, it had just exposed it. A week after I moved in, he showed up at my door. I wasn't expecting it. There was no warning text, no call, just a knock, sharp and insistent, that made my stomach drop. For a split second, I considered not answering, but something in me wanted to face him on my terms, in my space. I opened the door, and there he was, leaning against the hallway wall like he belonged there, like this was still his territory. He looked me up and down, taking in the bare apartment behind me. "Wow," he said, "this is smaller than I imagined." I didn't invite him in. I crossed my arms and asked what he wanted. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You always get so defensive," he said. "I came to check on you. You vanished." The audacity of that almost made me laugh. Vanished, as if I hadn't been responding with silence to his constant messages, as if he hadn't told me to leave. I told him I was fine and asked him again what he wanted. His smile faded just a bit. "You're really doing this," he said, "throwing everything away to prove a point?" That sentence said everything. To him, my life was something I was throwing away, not reclaiming. I told him I wasn't proving a point, I was choosing peace. He rolled his eyes. "You'll get bored," he said. "You always do." For the first time, his words didn't land. They floated past me, empty. I realized he was grasping for the version of me that flinched, that doubted herself. When he didn't find her, irritation crept into his voice. "You think you're better than me now?" he asked. I thought about that question long enough that it made him uncomfortable. Then I said, "I think I'm better to myself." The silence that followed was thick. He scoffed, muttered something about me being ungrateful, and walked away without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the realization that I just stood my ground. The final test arrived, disguised as nostalgia. It started with a voicemail. I almost deleted it without listening, but something in me wanted to know what version of Daniel would show up this time. His voice sounded tired, stripped of its usual confidence. "I'm not doing great," he said. I thought you should know." There was a pause, heavy and intentional. "I miss you." For a moment, I felt the old pull, not toward him exactly, but toward the role I used to play, the fixer, the one who showed up when he faltered, who patched the cracks and told herself that love meant endurance. That instinct rose automatically, like muscle memory. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, and let the feeling wash over me without acting on it. That was new, sitting with discomfort instead of rushing to soothe it. I didn't call him back. Instead, I went to therapy the next day and played the voicemail for my therapist. She listened carefully, then asked me a question that landed harder than anything Daniel had ever said. "If you go back now," she asked, "what part of yourself do you have to abandon?" I didn't answer right away. I already knew. I'd have to abandon the woman who'd learned to trust her own perception, the woman who'd built a life from the ground up, the woman who no longer mistook anxiety for passion. That night, Daniel texted again. "I drove past your place today." My stomach tightened. He followed it with, "Relax, I didn't stop." The message was meant to sound reassuring, but it felt like a warning, a reminder that he still felt entitled to orbit my life. I replied for the first time in months, just one line, "Please don't contact me again." I stared at the screen after sending it, waiting for regret to flood in. It didn't. What came instead was relief. He didn't take it well. Over the next week, he tried everything. Anger, guilt, sentimentality. He accused me of being cold, of erasing our history, of pretending he never mattered. He told me I'd changed, like it was an insult, and maybe I had. I hoped I had. Change was the point. Each message chipped away at the illusion that he was reaching out because he cared. He was reaching out because he couldn't stand not being the center of my decisions anymore. The worst part was how familiar his tactics felt. Even now, even after all the work I'd done, there were moments when his words slipped past my defenses, when I wondered if I was being too harsh, if I owed him closure, if I was running away instead of standing up. Those thoughts scared me more than his messages did, because they reminded me how deeply ingrained the dynamic had been. The turning point came unexpectedly, at a grocery store of all places. I was standing in the cereal aisle comparing prices when I ran into one of Daniel's coworkers from that dinner party months ago.
She looked surprised to see me, then smiled warmly. We exchanged pleasantries, and as she turned to leave, she said something that made my breath catch. "By the way," she said, "I'm glad you got out. Watching him talk to you that night was uncomfortable." She hesitated. "You deserve better." I stood there long after she walked away, heart pounding. For so long I'd wondered if I was imagining things, if others saw what I felt. Hearing it confirmed by someone who had no stake in my healing was like a final piece clicking into place. It wasn't just me. It never had been. That night, I blocked Daniel's number, email too, social media, every channel he'd used to keep a thread tied around me. My finger hovered over the screen before I confirmed it, not because I doubted the decision, but because I understood the weight of it. Blocking him wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of acceptance, accepting that he was never going to become the person I needed him to be, accepting that I didn't need his understanding to move on. In the weeks that followed, my life expanded in small, meaningful ways. I started taking a pottery class on Tuesday nights, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the nerve to pursue. My first attempts were lopsided and awkward, but I loved the feel of clay in my hands, the way it responded to gentle pressure instead of force. It felt symbolic somehow. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with, apologizing where I needed to, rebuilding slowly. Most of them welcomed me back without hesitation. There were still moments of grief. Healing didn't erase the good memories, and sometimes they surfaced unexpectedly. A song we used to listen to, a restaurant we loved. When that happened, I let myself feel the sadness without letting it rewrite the truth. Missing someone didn't mean they were good for me. Love and compatibility were not the same thing. That distinction had taken me years to learn. One evening, about 3 months after I'd left, Nadia came over for dinner. We sat on the floor again, this time because I wanted to, laughing over burnt garlic bread and cheap wine. She raised her glass and said, "To you." I asked what she meant. She shrugged. "You look like yourself again." The words made my throat tighten. I hadn't realized how lost I'd been until someone pointed out my return. Later that night, alone in bed, I thought about the woman I'd been when Daniel told me I'd come back begging. She'd been scared, unsure, conditioned to doubt her own resilience. I felt a surge of tenderness for her. She'd done the best she could with what she knew at the time, and when the moment came, she'd found the courage to walk out the door anyway. I also thought about Daniel, not with anger, but with clarity. I saw him now as someone deeply insecure, someone who mistook control for strength and certainty for truth. I couldn't fix that. I never could. Letting go of that responsibility felt like setting down a weight I'd been carrying for years. The story didn't end with a dramatic confrontation or a triumphant speech. It ended quietly, with me choosing myself again and again in ways that added up over time. It ended with boundaries instead of ultimatums, with self-trust instead of self-sacrifice. And yet, I knew there was one more chapter to tell, not about him, but about me, about the moment I fully understood what walking away had given me and how far I'd come from the woman who once believed she'd have to beg for love. The moment I fully understood what leaving had given me didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, the kind I used to rush through without noticing. I was standing at my kitchen counter, sunlight pooling across the chipped laminate, slicing vegetables for dinner. No one was watching. No one was judging how long it took or whether I'd seasoned things correctly. I caught myself humming, something soft and unself-conscious, and I stopped mid-note because it startled me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd hummed without feeling silly. That was when it hit me. Peace wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the absence of tension I'd grown so used to that I'd mistaken it for normal. With that realization came grief I hadn't expected. Not for Daniel exactly, but for the years I'd spent negotiating my worth, for the parts of myself I'd tucked away to make room for someone else's ego. I grieved the version of me who'd apologized for taking up space, who'd learned to phrase her needs like requests instead of truths. Some nights that grief settled heavy in my chest, and I let it. Healing, I was learning, meant honoring what was lost as much as celebrating what was gained. Work began to change too. Without Daniel's constant commentary in my ear, I found myself speaking up more in meetings. I applied for that promotion he'd once discouraged me from pursuing, the one he said would stress me out too much. The interview process was intense, and there were moments when doubt crept in, whispering his old words back at me. "You're not cut out for this. You'll fail." But this time, I recognized the voice. I named it, and then I chose not to listen. When I got the offer, I sat on my couch and cried. Not the quiet, contained tears I used to shed in bathrooms, but big, heaving sobs that felt like release. I texted Nadia first, then Mira. Their replies came flooding in, full of exclamation points and pride. No one asked how Daniel felt about it. No one questioned whether I could handle it. The contrast was stark and painful and beautiful all at once. Around this time, I started dating again, slowly, carefully, not because I felt incomplete on my own, but because I was curious about who I might be with someone new. The first few dates were awkward. I was hyper-aware of my boundaries, testing them like newly healed skin. There was one man, kind but dismissive in subtle ways, who interrupted me repeatedly. Halfway through the date, I felt that old urge to shrink, to laugh it off. Instead, I noticed it. I excused myself early and went home, proud of myself not for the decision, but for the awareness that preceded it. Another time, I went out with someone who listened, really listened. He asked questions without trying to steer the answers. When I told him about my work, he didn't joke about ambition. He celebrated it. The date didn't turn into anything long-term, but it didn't need to. It reminded me that respect wasn't rare or fragile. It was basic, and I was allowed to expect it. One evening, months after blocking Daniel, I received a message request from an unfamiliar account. My heart skipped before my brain caught up. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I recognized the pattern, the timing. Instead of spiraling, I deleted the request and went about my night. That might sound small, but it felt monumental. There was no lingering temptation to check, no curiosity about what he might say. His voice had finally faded from the center of my mind. I started volunteering on weekends, something I'd always wanted to do but never prioritized. Giving my time to others grounded me in a way nothing else had. It reminded me that my world was bigger than one relationship, one heartbreak, that I was part of a community, not an accessory in someone else's life. Each small commitment stitched me more firmly into myself. The more my life filled up, the clearer the contrast became. I thought back to the night he'd humiliated me in front of his coworkers, the way I'd laughed along to survive. That memory no longer flinched me. It made me compassionate toward my past self and fiercely protective of my present one. I understood now that humiliation thrives in isolation. Healing thrives in connection. One afternoon, my mother called me, her voice thoughtful. "I ran into Daniel's mother at the store," she said carefully. My chest tightened reflexively. "She asked how you were doing." I asked what she said. My mother smiled through the phone. "I told her you're doing wonderfully, that you're thriving." There was a pause. She looked surprised. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt complete. Other people's perceptions no longer felt like verdicts on my life. As the year edged towards its end, I marked the anniversary of the night I'd left, without ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement. I lit a candle, sat by the window, and reflected on the distance I traveled, not just physically, but internally. I no longer measured my choices against someone else's reactions. I no longer braced myself for criticism that might come out of nowhere. I trusted my own experience, my own feelings, my own strength. The sentence he'd thrown at me that night still surfaced occasionally, but it no longer stung. Leave if you want, you'll be back begging within a month. The power of those words had always depended on my belief in them. Without that belief, they were empty, wrong, almost laughable. What surprised me most was the gentleness that had replaced my anger. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need him to admit he was wrong. My life, lived fully and honestly, was proof enough. And that proof wasn't for him, it was for me. I wasn't finished growing, I knew that. There were still patterns to unlearn, still fears to face, but now I faced them from a place of steadiness instead of desperation. I had built something solid from the rubble of a relationship that had once defined me, and in doing so, I had discovered a truth that felt almost radical in its simplicity. Love should never require you to beg, and the woman who once feared she'd crawl back had learned to stand tall on her own.
By the time a full year had passed, my life no longer felt like a recovery project. It felt like a life. That distinction mattered more than I realized at first. Recovery implies returning to something you were before, but I wasn't interested in going backward. I was becoming someone new, shaped by what I had survived, but not defined by it. The promotion settled into a rhythm. My days were fuller, more demanding, but in a way that energized me instead of draining me. I noticed how confidently I spoke now, how I no longer softened my opinions with apologies. When I made mistakes, I owned them without spiraling into shame. No one mocked me for it, no one held it over my head. I was learning in real time that competence didn't come from perfection, it came from self-trust. There were still moments when the past tapped on my shoulder. Sometimes it came as a smell, like a certain cologne drifting past me on the street. Sometimes it came as a dream where I was back in that apartment, explaining myself over and over, my voice getting smaller the more I spoke. I would wake up unsettled, my heart racing, and then I'd look around my room, grounding myself in the present, my bed, my walls, my choices. The dreams grew less frequent as time went on, as if my mind was slowly releasing what it no longer needed to rehearse. One evening, after a long day at work, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly. It happened at a bookstore, of all places. I was browsing the shelves, lost in thought, when I heard my name spoken in a voice that once commanded my attention without effort. I turned, and there he was, standing a few feet away, looking thinner somehow, older. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to register that time had been moving for him too. For a split second, my body reacted before my mind did, a familiar tightening, a reflexive scan for danger. But then something else followed. Calm. "Hey," he said, tentative now. That alone told me everything. The certainty was gone. We stood there awkwardly, surrounded by quiet shelves and the faint smell of paper. He asked how I was. I said I was well. He told me he'd heard about my promotion. I thanked him. There was a pause, thick with everything we weren't saying. Finally, he sighed. "I didn't think you'd actually stay gone," he admitted. I looked at him then, really looked, and I felt no urge to correct him or explain myself. "I know," I said simply. He searched my face as if looking for the old reactions, the defensiveness, the longing. He didn't find them. "You seem different," he said. I smiled, not out of politeness, but because the statement felt true in the best possible way. "I am." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret maybe, or confusion. "I guess I underestimated you," he said, attempting a half smile. I thought about all the ways he had underestimated me, my resilience, my capacity for growth, my willingness to walk away. "You did," I agreed without malice. We stood there another moment, and then I told him I had to go. He nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. As I walked out into the evening air, my heart felt steady. There was no rush of triumph, no desire to replay the encounter. It was just done.
Closure, I realized, wasn't something he could give me. It was something I'd already claimed. That night, I journaled about the encounter, not to dissect it, but to mark it, a full circle moment, proof that I could face the past without being pulled back into it. I wrote about how his old words had once felt like a curse and now felt like a miscalculation. I wrote about how leaving had been the bravest thing I'd ever done, even though it had felt like the scariest. As spring arrived, I found myself craving change again, not out of dissatisfaction, but curiosity. I rearranged my apartment, painted one wall a deep, calming blue. I took a short solo trip, something I'd never dared to do before. Sitting alone in a cafe in a city where no one knew my history, I felt expansive, untethered. I realized how much of my former identity had been built in relation to someone else, and how liberating it was to exist without that constant reference point. People started coming to me for advice, friends leaving unhealthy relationships, coworkers struggling with self-doubt. I listened, careful not to project my story onto theirs, but I recognized the same fear in their voices, the fear of starting over, the fear of being wrong, the fear of not being enough alone. When they asked how I did it, how I left, I always said the same thing. I stopped asking for permission. That truth had reshaped every area of my life. I no longer waited for someone else's approval to pursue what mattered to me. I trusted my instincts, even when they led me into uncertainty, especially then. I understood now that confidence wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to move forward despite it. On the anniversary of the night Daniel had laughed and told me I'd be back begging, I did something symbolic. I wrote his sentence down on a piece of paper exactly as he'd said it. I read it out loud once, letting it echo in the room. Then I folded the paper carefully and tore it in half. Not dramatically, not angrily, just deliberately. I threw the pieces away and washed my hands, as if releasing something tangible. Later, as I lay in bed, I reflected on how close I'd come to believing him, how easily certainty, when delivered with confidence, can masquerade as truth. I thought about how many people stay in places that diminish them because someone else has convinced them they can't survive without it. And I wished quietly that they could feel what I felt now, the grounded certainty that they could. My life wasn't perfect. I still had bad days. I still doubted myself sometimes. But the difference was profound. My doubts no longer defined me. They were visitors, not residents. I had built a foundation strong enough to hold them without collapsing. I fell asleep that night with a sense of completion I hadn't known before, not because everything was finished, but because something fundamental had settled into place. I had learned to leave without begging, to stay without shrinking, to choose myself without apology. And as I drifted off, I understood that the story I'd been living wasn't just about walking away from someone who underestimated me. It was about finally recognizing my own worth and refusing to negotiate it ever again.
The story didn't truly settle into my bones until something unexpected happened, something that forced me to see myself through the eyes of the woman I used to be. It was a message from a stranger, an email actually, sent to my work address. The subject line read, "I think I'm living your old life." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made me open it. The woman who wrote it said she'd heard me speak at a small professional panel a few weeks earlier. She said one line I'd mentioned in passing had stayed with her. "I stopped asking for permission," I'd said, almost casually. She told me she'd gone home and cried in her car afterward. She was younger than me had been when I met Daniel. Same patterns, different details. A boyfriend who joked at her expense, who framed control as concern, who told her she was lucky he put up with her sensitivity. As I read her words, I felt a strange mix of sadness and recognition. She asked me how I'd known when it was time to leave, how I'd found the courage. She ended her message with, "I'm scared he's right about me." I sat with that email for a long time before replying because the truth was I hadn't known. Not in the way we imagine clarity arriving, fully formed and confident. I hadn't left because I was fearless. I'd left because staying hurt more than the uncertainty of going. I wrote back honestly. I told her that courage doesn't feel like courage when you're in it. It feels like shaking hands and a racing heart and doing it anyway. I told her that anyone who needs you to believe you're nothing without them is already telling you who they are. When she replied to thank me, something shifted inside me. I realized my story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a mirror, a map for someone else standing at the edge of a decision, and that made me take my own journey more seriously, not as something I'd survived, but as something I'd learned from. That realization rippled outward. I started speaking more openly about emotional boundaries, about subtle forms of humiliation that get brushed off as jokes. Not loudly, not angrily, just truthfully. I noticed how often people nodded along, how many conversations ended with quiet confessions. I thought it was just me. I didn't know that counted as emotional harm. I've been telling myself I'm too sensitive. Each time I thought back to the night Daniel laughed and told me I'd be back begging, how easily I could have internalized that as prophecy instead of provocation, how close I'd come to proving him right, not because he was correct, but because I'd once believed I couldn't survive without his validation. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old storage box, I found a sweater I used to wear around him. It was soft, oversized, something I'd chosen because it made me feel small and unremarkable. I held it up and felt a wave of memory wash over me. The woman who wore this had been trying to disappear in plain sight. I folded it carefully and donated it the next day. Not because it was cursed or symbolic, but because I didn't need to carry that version of myself forward anymore. My life continued to unfold in ways that felt aligned rather than forced. I deepened friendships that had survived my absence. I strengthened boundaries with people who tested them. I learned to sit with discomfort without immediately blaming myself. These weren't grand transformations. They were quiet practices, repeated daily, that added up to something sturdy. Occasionally, someone would ask about Daniel, usually out of curiosity rather than concern. I'd answer simply, we weren't right for each other. That was enough. I didn't need to recount the humiliation or defend my choice. The need to explain had faded, replaced with a confidence that didn't require witnesses. What stayed with me most was the memory of his certainty, how sure he'd been, how absolute his prediction sounded. You'll be back begging within a month. I understood now that certainty like that often comes from fear. Fear of being left, fear of losing control, fear of facing oneself without a convenient scapegoat. His confidence hadn't been strength, it was a bluff. On a quiet evening, sitting by my window as the city lights flickered on, I thought about how differently that sentence would land if someone said it to me now. It wouldn't scare me. It wouldn't hook into my insecurities. It would sound like what it always was, a reflection of someone else's limitations, not my own. I breathed deeply, feeling the steadiness in my chest, and understood something fundamental. The real victory hadn't been leaving, it had been staying gone, staying true, staying with myself through the discomfort of growth. That was the part no one talks about. Walking away is one decision. Building a life that no longer needs permission is 1,000 small ones made every day. And as I sat there, grounded and whole, I knew there was only one thing left to do, to say, clearly and without bitterness, what this journey had taught me. To close the story not with anger or triumph, but with truth, the kind that lingers, the kind that frees. There's a strange quiet that comes when a chapter truly ends. Not the kind that feels empty or unresolved, but the kind that settles gently like dust after a long journey. That's what I felt as I began to understand that my story with Daniel no longer needed revisiting, revising, or defending. It simply was. A chapter that taught me what love should never cost. I used to think closure was a conversation, a final explanation, an apology exchanged, or a wrong finally admitted. But the older I get, the more I understand that closure is internal. It's the moment you stop asking why someone treated you the way they did and start asking why you stayed as long as you did. Not to shame yourself, but to learn, to grow, to forgive yourself for surviving the only way you knew how at the time. One afternoon, while walking home from work, I passed a couple arguing on the sidewalk. Nothing dramatic, just raised voices and sharp words disguised as jokes. The woman laughed in that familiar way, the way I used to laugh, too quickly, too brightly, as if to smooth over something that had cut deeper than she wanted to admit. I felt a pang in my chest, not judgment, but recognition and compassion. For her, for my past self, for anyone who has ever learned to smile through disrespect because it felt safer than confronting it. That was when it truly hit me. The humiliation I endured hadn't broken me, it had clarified me. It had stripped away illusions I didn't know I was carrying. I had learned, painfully and slowly, that love doesn't humiliate. It doesn't belittle or challenge your worth as a test of loyalty. Love doesn't dare you to leave just to see how much you'll tolerate. For a long time, I thought strength looked like endurance, like staying, explaining, adjusting, forgiving endlessly. I thought leaving meant failure, but I was wrong. Strength, I've learned, often looks quiet. It looks like packing a bag with shaking hands. It looks like sleeping on a couch and not knowing what comes next. It looks like choosing yourself even when you're terrified of the consequences. The night Daniel told me I'd be back begging within a month, he believed he was stating a fact. He believed he knew me better than I knew myself. And maybe, at the time, he did know the version of me that doubted her own resilience, the version of me that confused familiarity with safety. But people grow, sometimes in silence, sometimes in pain, sometimes in ways that surprise everyone, including themselves. I didn't go back. Not because it was easy, and not because I was fearless, but because something inside me finally said, enough. Enough shrinking, enough laughing things off, enough proving my worth to someone who benefited from denying it. Walking away wasn't an act of defiance, it was an act of self-respect. If there's one thing I wish I could tell the woman I was back then, it's this. You are not weak for loving deeply. You are not foolish for hoping things would change. And you are not broken for staying longer than you should have. You were surviving. And when the moment came, you chose differently. That matters. My life now is not perfect. It's real. It's full. It's mine. I wake up without dread. I speak without rehearsing. I make decisions without bracing for someone else's reaction. And when challenges come, as they always do, I meet them with a quiet confidence I once thought was reserved for other people. Sometimes late at night, I think about how easily my story could have gone another way, how easily I could have gone back, apologized for being too sensitive, and folded myself back into something smaller. I think about how many people do exactly that, not because they want to, but because they're told they can't survive without the person hurting them. And I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the pain that woke me up and for the courage that carried me through it. The truth is, anyone who tells you you'll come back begging is revealing more about their need for control than your capacity for independence. They're betting on your fear, on your doubt, on your belief that love must be earned through endurance. But love that requires you to beg isn't love, it's leverage. I didn't win by leaving. I won by learning to stay with myself, by trusting my own voice when it finally spoke up, by building a life that doesn't require permission, justification, or shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. If you're listening to this and you see yourself somewhere in my story, I want you to know this. The moment you start questioning whether you deserve better is the moment you already believe you do.
Leaving doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means you finally chose honesty over habit. I didn't go back begging. I walked forward, becoming. And that is how this story ends.